The whole process for making currency is incredibly controlled. I mean, every single step is designed for security and to make sure every note looks the same. But all that complexity, that's also what opens the door for some of the coolest errors you'll ever see.
For modern US money, it's basically a three-act play. First up is the back of the note. We use a method called intaglio, where ink gets forced into these superfine engraved lines on a metal plate under thousands of pounds of pressure. Then the sheets have to sit and cure, sometimes for up to 72 hours, just to make sure that ink is perfectly dry. Next, we do it again for the second print, which is the face of the note, the portrait, the borders, all that. And finally, the third print, the overprint. That's where the seals and serial numbers get added. Only after all that do the sheets finally get cut. Remember those three distinct printing stages? They are the absolute key to figuring out every error we're about to look at.
Let's kick things off with some of the most fundamental mistakes you can get. Pretty much every error in this category boils down to one simple thing: a person feeding a sheet of notes into a massive printing press the wrong way. It's a small human mistake with some really big visual consequences.
The inverted back. This one's a classic, a really dramatic error. So the back of the sheet gets printed just fine on the first run, but then when it's time for the second print, the face, an operator just feeds the entire stack in upside down. Simple as that. The result, a perfectly printed note where the back is completely inverted. And here's a little insider detail for you. Since the back is technically printed first, it's actually an inverted front. But in the collecting world, inverted back is just the name that stuck.
Now, things get really wild when the mix-up isn't just the orientation, but the printing plates themselves. Just imagine a fresh stack of sheets, and they've all got the back of a $10 bill printed on them. But then that stack gets accidentally taken over and fed into a press that's set up with a plate for the face of a $20 bill. What you get is this impossible hybrid note. It's one of the most serious errors out there because it means there was a total breakdown in the factory's controls.
So what if the sheet is fed in the right way up, but it's just not perfectly straight? Well, that's when you get a misalignment. It could be shifted up, down, left, or right. If this happens on the first or second print, the main design will be way off center. If it happens during the third print, you'll see the serial numbers and seals are shifted. The key thing to look for here is that one print will be off, but the others will be centered perfectly. That's how you know for sure it's a misalignment and not a simple cutting error, which we'll get to later.
So we've talked about where the paper goes. Now let's zoom in a little closer, right down to the printing plate itself. These next errors aren't about the paper's position at all. They're about that delicate and honestly pretty violent process of applying ink to paper.
An offset error? It looks like a ghost, right? A mirrored image of one side seems to have bled through to the other. You might think, oh, the ink was just too wet. But the real reason, the mechanical failure behind it, is actually way more fascinating. Let me show you exactly what's happening.
So check this out. Normally, the inked plate comes down and presses the paper against a clean cylinder. Simple. But what happens if the machine misfeeds and no paper goes through? Well, the press doesn't just stop. The inked plate smacks right into the bare impression cylinder. And in that instant, the cylinder itself becomes a printing plate, holding a perfect mirrored image. So when the next sheet of paper feeds through correctly, it gets the normal print on one side, and on the other, it picks up that leftover ink from the cylinder. That's your ghost image.
Now this is a totally different kind of extra ink. It's not a mirrored image from the other side. A double print error is what happens when a sheet literally goes through the same printing press twice. It gets two full impressions from the same plate. And usually one is just slightly off from the other, which creates this really weird, blurry, almost 3D-like effect. And this can happen on any of the three print stages, which means you can get some really unique-looking errors.
Then you've got these two classic problems. An insufficient inking error is basically what it sounds like. The ink supply runs low, starving the plate and leaving the design looking all faint and washed out. An ink smear is the exact opposite problem. There's a special blade that's supposed to wipe all the excess ink off the plate before it prints. When that blade fails, well, you get a huge, uncontrolled smear of ink right across the note.
So far, we've looked at mistakes with paper placement and ink. But what happens when something physically gets in the way? Maybe it's a flaw in the paper itself, or maybe it's some random object that wanders onto the press.
Fold errors are pretty common, but you've got to know the difference between the two main types. A gutter fold is when there's already a crease in the paper before any ink touches it. The plate comes down, but it can't press into that little folded valley, so when you unfold it, you see a blank, unprinted line. A printed fold is different.
That happens when a sheet folds over in between the printing stages. This means part of a later print can end up on the wrong side of the note or in the wrong place entirely. Let's just walk through that. So you've got a sheet with a perfectly normal back print. It's on its way to the next stage, but a corner gets snagged and folds over. Then the third press comes down to add the seals and serial numbers. Part of that serial number gets printed right onto that folded bit of paper. If you were to find that note and unfold a corner, you'd see a piece of the serial number hanging out on the back. For a collector, that's a forensic clue. It proves, without a doubt, exactly when that fold happened.
Sometimes the thing getting in the way is a totally foreign object. I'm talking a stray piece of scrap paper, a bit of tape, you name it. If that lands on the sheet before a print run, it acts like a little mask. The plate comes down, but the ink is blocked, leaving a blank area in the exact shape of whatever fell on it. The absolute holy grail for collectors are retained obstructions, which is when the piece of debris that caused the error is still stuck to the finished note.
All right, we are so close to the finish line. The note has its back, its face, all the ink is there. But some of the most obvious, eye-catching errors can happen in the last two steps, adding the serial numbers and the final cut. This should sound familiar. Just like an inverted back, this is another sheet-feeding error, but it happens way later. The sheet has a perfectly normal front and back, but it gets fed into that third and final press upside down. This means only the treasury seal and serial numbers appear inverted. In some even rarer cases, the sheet gets fed in face down, and the entire overprint ends up on the back of the note. This is such a cool and subtle difference. A mismatched serial number is a big picture error. The two separate numbering machines that print the numbers on the left and right sides of the note just get out of sync with each other. A stuck digit, on the other hand, is a tiny picture error. This is when just one little number wheel inside one of those machines gets jammed. It fails to turn over properly, so you end up with a single digit that's out of line and looks kind of mushy. This is it. The very last chance for a mistake to happen. The big, fully printed sheets are stacked up and sent to a giant guillotine cutter. If that stack isn't lined up perfectly with the blade, the cut's going to be off. And that creates a note with a massive border on one side, and on the other side, a little slice of the design from the note that was next to it on the sheet. So after this whole tour through a factory of chaos, why does all this technical stuff actually matter? Well, because for a collector, just spotting an error is only step one. Understanding how and why it was created, that's what turns this from just a hobby into a science.
At the end of the day, it really comes down to this. A perfect note just tells you that the system worked. But an error note, that tells you how the system works. Each one is a little diagnostic snapshot. It's a lesson in engineering, in mechanics.